Hi team, Craig here with another lecture in the AMP lecture series. This one is part 2 of muscle physiology. Hopefully it hasn't been too long since you looked at part 1. You remember in part 1 of muscle physiology we looked at the players involved in muscle contraction. So we looked at, for starters, the connection between the nervous system, the motor neuron, and the muscle fibers. We then looked at the process of the sliding filament theory and how once the electricity had reached the muscle fiber, how it caused the connection between actin and myosin to occur, the cross bridges and power strokes that cause muscle contraction. In this half of the lecture, we'll do a little revision on that topic there, but more importantly look at how muscle fibers are recruited. We'll look at the different muscle fiber types, and then we'll also explore a little around why that is the way it is. Why have we got certain types of muscle fibers, and why do other countries produce athletes maybe with superior allocations of muscle fibers? So what you'll need for the completion of this topic is your Prezi, which you're watching right now, and of course your mock questions, where we pull out the key testable information that'll be part of the examination, section 2 of the nervous system muscle physiology test. So that is this document here, the mock questions of test 1. Here's nervous system as you see, and we roll down and you'll see muscle physiology occurs next. And we've filled out most of these questions here. We're on to the sort of last page here, which is going to talk about the muscle fiber types, etc. So if you would keep from question 13 on ready at hand to fill in any questions that come up as we go. So we'll crack on. So from our first class we now understand how a muscle fiber contracts, and we need to probably stop thinking of muscle fibers as individual entities, because they never contract as a singular fiber. Instead, we should really talk about the recruitment of muscle fibers as being recruited in motor units. So motor units are collections of fibers that are all innervated by the same motor neuron. If we look at the picture down here, we can see here's a motor unit with one motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers that are attached to that motor neuron that will of course fire if the threshold is reached. Now each muscle fiber type and each pocket has its own threshold, and if the electrical stimulus is enough to reach that threshold, then all of the muscle fibers that are found within that motor unit will fire with 100% force. And I'll remind you again that the way in which we either reduce or increase the amount of force that an individual muscle produces, and let's use a biceps as an example there, so a biceps brachii, if we were doing a bicep curl, how do we manipulate the amount of force we use to do a simple task like pick up a pen or a computer mouse versus pick up a heavy weight? Well, we know that we manipulate that amount of strength the muscle produces by activating more motor neurons, which will activate more motor units of muscle fibers. So the more strength we need, then the more motor neurons sending messages down to reach the threshold of more pockets of fibers. And therefore, we get greater fiber contraction and more strength. When we don't need to use a lot of force, then we want a more efficient mechanism for that. We only want to do a small task. You don't want to utilize a whole lot of energy to do that little task. Then, of course, we send messages down only a few motor neurons to activate a few muscle fiber pockets or motor units. And that's how we grade the strength of contraction within an individual muscle. Now, important to remember that even though we're only recruiting a few small motor units, that those fibers found within the motor units are contracting with 100% of their force. So in a small muscle, one motor neuron might innervate just a few muscle fibers, and there's a good example. The eye here has about 23 muscle fibers associated with one motor neuron, and therefore is one of the smallest motor units you can find in the body, whereas a large muscle, one nerve fiber might innervate more than 500 muscle fibers. And typically you'll find the further you are from the central nervous system, so the further you go down the limbs, the legs, etc., the more fibers are being fired as a result of less motor neurons travelling down those pathways further away from the nervous system. So much harder to fire just a small portion of your calves, being so far away from the spinal cord. one motor neuron actually activates a whole lot, up to 2,000 muscle fibers within that calf muscle, meaning that it's very hard to do anything but a quite forceful contraction with them. It also means that they're probably not very efficient if we're using that much muscular force just to do basic tasks like stand up on your toes. So, the same principle we learned in the nervous system applies, the all or nothing principle. If the threshold of a given motor unit is reached, then all of the fibers within that motor neuron will fire with 100% force. This is where muscle fiber types come into play. So if each motor neuron has its own threshold, then it makes sense that the slow twitch fibers that we have in our body that we use for endurance type events would be more efficient. And therefore, we'd want to utilize them more for tasks that are a little easier on the body. And that way we don't chew through our energy reserves so quickly. So slow twitch fibers have a lower threshold for electricity, meaning that it takes less electricity to get them to fire. And that's how we send graded impulses down our motor neurons. So that first the body typically will choose slow twitch and try to get the job done with slow twitch so that it doesn't waste a whole lot of energy and effort. If that's not enough, then the body will build on that force from the slow twitch fibers by adding in our fast twitch fibers to the mix. And this is known as selective recruitment. So as we've established, slow twitch fibers have a lower threshold than fast twitch fibers, which means a weaker signal is needed to fire them. The other things we'll learn about slow twitch fibers is that they're very efficient and they don't chew through our fuel as quickly. And therefore we're able to do certain tasks without running out of energy. And that's really important from a day-to-day task perspective. You can imagine if you had to pick up a pen off the table and you were to fire every single muscle fiber in your bicep, then pretty soon you would get very tired of lifting up a pen, and it would become quite a taxing task. So this little picture here sort of illustrates a fiber twitch, if you like. So this is the electrical stimulus that is coming down to fire the motor unit. Okay, and what we'll notice is that slow twitch fibers, and this is very simplified obviously, but the slow twitch fibers here have the lowest threshold. The intermediate fibers, which we'll learn about soon, have sort of a middle threshold here, and then the highest threshold, the most electricity required to fire fiber, comes in the fast twitch fibers. So if we look at the twitch that's there in the white line right now, that goes up and down, can we answer which of the fibers will fire if this amount of electricity travelled down the motor neurons? And the answer, of course, is both slow twitch and intermediate fibers would fire, but fast twitch fibers would not. And that is the all or nothing principle. Obviously, the threshold has been reached by the electrical peak here, which means that these fibers that the motor neuron is attached to will fire, yet the threshold has not been reached yet by fast twitch fibers, and therefore they wouldn't contract. If we wanted them to contract, obviously more electricity through summation would have to occur, and we'd have to take that peak higher than the green line there, and that would cause all muscle fibers to contract. And in that sense there, that's how you would get the maximum force contraction from a muscle, as if you would have all slow twitch, intermediate, and fast twitch fibers firing. Now, something we'll focus on a little bit more later is it possible to bypass those slow twitch fibers? Because, of course, I've already mentioned that we typically try to use them first because they're the most efficient. And if we can get the job done with them, why not get it done? Therefore, we don't chew through our fuel reserves. So the only time that would happen really is if we were to squeeze this electrical impulse closer together here, meaning we reduce the time over which it's applied. So if this went straight up and straight down very, very quickly, then what would happen is we would effectively bypass our slow twitch fibers because the time required for them to fire wouldn't be sufficient. And that means only in this case would the fast twitch fibers fire. And this, of course, would represent something we would call power or plyometric type training, where you're actively targeting fast twitch fibers to make them functionally stronger and functionally quicker. And that's useful for people, obviously, that have explosive elements to their sport in terms of jumping and throwing, punching, and other explosive sort of movements within their sport. So we would actively work to target the fast twitch fibers and force the body to rely on them during those quick movements so that they could get better and hone their abilities to do that. So knowing what we know now, we can answer the question, how does the contraction strength of a muscle vary? And we know now that it doesn't depend on how strongly fibers contract, because fibers can only contract 100%. It's how many fibers or how many motor units are contracted during the movement. The nervous system will recruit selectively the number of motor units it deems necessary to create the desired response. And of course, when you first start an activity, let's say you're starting a running program or something like that, you're bound to be less efficient at the start until your nervous system works out the most efficient way to do things. And this is where technique comes in. We're constantly honing technique in the gym and in our aerobic-based sports to become more efficient at the activity that we're doing. We want to lift more weight with less effort. We want to run faster for longer. And that's all about efficiency. So this is where technique comes in. And with technique and practice, we can hone our central nervous system's ability to choose the right amount of fibers to get the job done efficiently. Activating more muscle fibers will produce more force, and when you don't need to produce a lot of force, then obviously you're only going to choose a few motor units to get the job done, and that'll keep fuel in reserve for later. Slow twitch motor neurons are smaller and typically will innervate less fibers in a block than fast twitch motor neurons. So for most low intensity type activities, we're going to be recruiting slow twitch fibers. If we pick up the intensity or the time or quickness that the contraction has to occur over increases, then fast twitch fibers would be used there. Now you'll see here a reference to something called FTA, and this is fast twitch A fiber, and then over here FTB, fast twitch B. FTBs are the ones that we would think of as pure fast twitch, whereas FTAs are also known as intermediate fibers. And we'll talk more about them soon, but the basic premise of an FTA is that it has the ability to swing both ways. It has the ability to act more like a fast twitch fiber or more like a slow twitch fiber, dependent on the type of training that you undertake. Generally, in most tasks, your body will try to use slow twitch fibers first, then build in the intermediate and fast twitch fibers on top of that to increase the force production required from the muscle to get the job done. And that's why typically in strength-based activities, it's better to gradually move an object. If you think about pushing a car, you don't run up and drop the shoulder on it. You don't create that really fast sort of explosive impulse into the car. You actually take the weight of the car, you apply force to it gradually, which builds the number of fibers that you are using, and gradually the car starts to move. The body uses what it needs to get the car moving. Same with the deadlift. You don't explode the bar off the floor. It's a slow and sustained process where you build the momentum as more and more fibers get brought into the equation. Okay, so let's have a look at these muscle fiber types. So you see the picture there indicates a chicken who's obviously had some sunbathing going on there, but chicken's a great place to start when we talk about fiber types and allocations. Okay, so we'll get into the cuts of meat soon. It might seem a bit weird that we're going to talk about chicken, but they're an ideal animal to introduce the concept of fiber types. But let's start with the different types of fibers. It's generally accepted that there are 3 different muscle fiber types in the body. Slow twitch, fast twitch, and intermediate would be the most common names for them. But you can see here that there are different names associated with them. So slow twitch in brackets that you see are also known as type 1 fibers. They're also known as slow oxidative fibers. Oxidative being the energy system that they predominantly utilize, of course being aerobic in nature. Then you've got your fast twitch type 2B, which are our pure fast twitch fibers. And then you've got your fast twitch type 2As, also known as FTAs, and also known as intermediate. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bring up our Word document, and we're going to add that in at question 13 here. So you can see the spaces here to put in the different fiber types by the different names. So under number 1 here, if you just write in slow twitch, and those are also known as type 1 fibers. We'll then put in FTB or fast twitch B fibers, and they're also known as type 2B. And then we have our fast twitch A fibers, also known as type 2A fibers, and you can also add in there that they're known as intermediate fibers. And the importance of knowing the different names from the exam perspective is that the questions will often use the different terminologies, and it's important that you're able to recognise what fibres are being talked about in the questions. Okay, so we'll dive in and have a look at the individual characteristics of these different fibres. One of the key things we've got to look at here, though, are some common things that are found within all fibres, and it's the levels of these that somewhat dictate what they're able to do. So two key players inside the muscle fibre are the mitochondria and the myoglobin. The mitochondria is essentially a little powerhouse where ATP combustion occurs. So these are the little cells that we need that produce energy from the fuel that we have, so usable forms of energy. And predominantly we use more ATP. I know this is a little bit difficult to get your head around. You would think that high intensity explosive exercise would use more fuel, and it does per unit of time, so over 10 seconds it certainly would use more fuel than the aerobic energy system, but of course it doesn't last very long. The aerobic system lasts for up to a few hours, so of course it's going to need to produce ongoing ATP production for muscle contraction. Okay, so you would expect to see higher amounts of these mitochondria in the slow twitch muscle fibers because of course that ongoing ATP production is required. Similarly, myoglobin would be found in more amounts in slow twitch muscle fibers. It's a storage pigment for oxygen. So we know hemoglobin carries oxygen through the bloodstream, and once it arrives at the muscle cell, the myoglobin will effectively grab that oxygen and store a limited amount there. Okay, and that's really important for both the aerobic and anaerobic systems. Of course, the anaerobic system relies on the stored oxygen, and that's why it lasts around 10 seconds of maximal activity. But the aerobic system, of course, relies on an ongoing delivery of oxygen as well, and therefore requires more myoglobin. And myoglobin is a red pigment, similar to hemoglobin, which glows red as part of the red blood cell when it's got oxygen saturating it. And that, I guess, will explain a little bit soon when we talk about meat types or muscle types, why slow twitch fibre meat is essentially redder in nature. Not only does it have more blood in it, but it has more myoglobin. So what can we say about slow twitch fibres? Quite a few things here. We'll just pick out the key ones. So they're also known as slow oxidative, as I said before, meaning that they use the oxidative system. They're usually used for posture and low intensity movement. And some things we can say about them is they have high mitochondria. They have more blood vessels or capillaries than fast twitch fibres, meaning that they have a lot more blood flowing through them. And of course that blood is there for the ongoing delivery of fuel and the ongoing delivery of oxygen and the ongoing removal of carbon dioxide. They also have more myoglobin, as I mentioned before. They use the aerobic system, therefore have a high aerobic capacity. Probably the downsides of them is they have lower tension or strength and power than the fast twitch fibres. And they take a little bit longer, about double the time to contract. It's not long, we're talking milliseconds here, but it does have a role in the way in which we selectively recruit fibres. And if you go quickly into a contraction, of course there may not be time for slow twitch to get involved. Because they have this great blood flow, they have higher efficiency, they use less energy, and they produce less waste. And of course with the additional blood flow that comes through them, we can remove that waste before it accumulates. They therefore are able to resist fatigue for longer. And there are usually a couple of places in the human body where you can find always an abundance of slow twitch fibres, and they tend to be postural type muscles. So you're talking lower back muscles that keep your body upright. Your soleus would be another example, probably your neck extensors as well. Those kind of things that we use to hold our shoulders and our head up for long periods of time. You can imagine the problems we'd have if they fatigued too quickly. In contrast, let's look at the fast twitch type 2B fibres, and you'll see that they're virtually opposites of the slow twitch. They have a smaller number of mitochondria because they're not reliant on constant energy production. They're not going to last that long. They have a limited ability to use oxygen, but a large anaerobic capacity, meaning a very, very good ability to work without oxygen. They generate much more force than the other fibers, and that's usually because they have more cross bridges. So that's more actin and myosin connections, more oars in the water, if you like, and therefore more pulling power. Unfortunately, because of that, they chew through a hell of a lot more ATP, and they fatigue quickly because they don't have the blood flow that the slow twitch fibers have. They have a very fast speed of contraction, which means they can elicit a contraction in a much quicker time than a slow twitch. The gastrocnemius muscle of a 100-meter sprinter will of course have high levels of type 2B fibers. But this of course is where the differences occur between different people and different sports. A marathoner may have a high proportion of type 1 fibers in the same muscle. And this is where the genetic predisposition to having certain types of fibers is brought up for the first time. The intermediate fibers, known as fast twitch type 2As, they have characteristics of both type 1 and type 2 fibers. So it's not that they can be converted, they can be trained to act more like one or the other. They are obviously more like fast twitch fibers to start, and that's why they're called fast twitch type 2A fibers. But a lot of that is actually due to the fact they have fast twitch motor neurons attached to them, meaning they can conduct electricity quicker and therefore get involved in the activity quicker than slow twitch. In saying that, they do have high to moderate mitochondrial levels, and they can use both the aerobic and anaerobic systems. Their efficiency is not bad, their speed of shortening is fast, and they have some ability to resist fatigue, unlike the type 2Bs. They can still produce lots of force, and therefore are quite strong in nature. So quite different characteristics, and you can see on the table here, if you just look between the type 2Bs and the type 1s, you can see opposites in every characteristic, and then the type 2As having elements of both. Now, of course, worth mentioning that the average human being has roughly a 50-50 split of type 1 and type 2 fibers, with the type 2As being the least abundant in the body. An average person would probably have more like a 55% type 1 allocation and a 45% type 2 allocation. However, as we're about to determine as we get into these different athletes at the highest level, that genetics can play a huge part in the disposition of your fibers, and you could be predispositioned to having a much different percentage of fibers in your body than the average punter. Good time to click back into our questions here, guys, and we can answer some of these here now. First of all, we'll go through this number 14. Which fibers have the highest oxidative or aerobic capacity? The answer, of course, is slow twitch. During what kind of exercise is slow twitch muscle fiber recruited? The answer to that, keeping it general, is long duration aerobic activity. So you may put examples down like marathon running, cross-country skiing, lawn bowls would be an example, walking or jogging would be an example. Which fiber types would you expect to see in a sprinter's gastrocnemius or calves muscle in large amounts? And of course that's type 2B fibers. And then if we look at number 17, we can also put this in. What are the 4 major characteristics of slow twitch muscle fibers? And again, we'll go to our, you can stay on your page there. I'll just go back in to the key slide there so we can get our spellings and things there. We have, if I just drop back to slow twitch, we're going to write in high mitochondria, high capillaries, high myoglobin, and high fatigue resistance are the 4 things that I want you to remember there. So that's mitochondria, capillaries, myoglobin, and fatigue resistance. 4 key characteristics of slow twitch fibers. And there's a reason I've picked those 4, which will become clear soon. Okay, so we'll jump back in to the Prezi now. And let's talk meat. So from what we know now, we're in a better place to sort of have this discussion. There are obviously different cuts of meat that we eat, and we have to start thinking about meat. The meat of animals is essentially the muscle of animals. Okay, so dark or white cuts of meat. We've got, for example, here, you'll see some beef over here, which is of course quite dark. Here's some pork, which is a little lighter, And here's a chicken breast, which is a lot lighter than the other two cuts here. So with the information we've covered so far, what would be your answer to that question? Why are some cuts of meat dark and some cuts of meat light? Now we go to fibre types here, don't we? We go back to fibre types and we think, well, let's start with beef. Where does beef come from? It comes from cows. What do cows do all day? They effectively stand and eat grass. So not much. If you've ever been chased by a cow or made a cow run, you'll know that cows aren't particularly fast or explosive. So that would indicate that the majority of their muscle is slow twitch muscle fibers. So slow twitch muscle fibers, they stand for the majority of the day, obviously. So therefore they're going to need those postural muscles. And they walk sometimes quite long distances over the course of a day, which again would be slow twitch muscle fibers. And what do we know about slow twitch muscle fibers? They are full of capillaries, which are blood vessels, which means they are full of blood. And it's the presence of this blood, and you've all seen red meat and how it leaves blood and residue. If it was squeezed or if it was pressurized, then blood would come out, and that indicates why it's a darker cut. It's also much more tender generally than other cuts of lighter meat. So pork, for example, when overcooked, is quite tough. Steak can be, depending on the cut and depending on where it is. And again, that's just an indication of where the meats come from and what type of muscle that you're eating. Chicken breast, on the other hand, would be predominantly fast twitch fibers. You think, why? Where is the breast? What's the peak, effectively? And what's the peak attached to on birds? It's attached to wings. And in this case, chickens, you'll agree, are not long flyers. They don't fly south for the winter. They're bred, effectively, for meat. They have their wings clipped, but they'll only use their wings in dire situations, fight or flight situations, to get clearance away from a dog or a human or something like that. So a couple of quick flaps, a couple of powerful flaps of the wing allows them to skip away from some danger. So again, fast twitch fibers in there will help with that. That makes the meat light in colour, and if you cut into it, there's not a lot of blood in there. In fact, you find very few blood vessels within it. However, their legs, if you look at a drumstick or a leg, a thigh, you'll find that the meat is a little darker. And when you think about chickens again, they spend most of their day roosting or walking around, pecking, and therefore they would need some good endurance in their legs, and that would explain why the meat in chicken drumstick or a chicken thigh is much darker. Now humans, we would also have darker and lighter cuts of meat. Some of our muscles, like we explained before, that are mainly postural muscles, would be the most tender and blood-filled muscles of our body because they're used predominantly or exclusively in some cases for endurance-based activities like posture. Whereas other muscles that are there for quicker movements and explosive movements would be much lighter in colour and much tougher. So muscles will adapt to the function they're required for, and they will also adapt due to training. But you do have this baseline material that you've got to work with that can't be changed to any great degree. So you either have it or you don't. And I think by the time we've reached the age that you guys are, you sort of know what you're good at. If you, through your schooling days, always won endurance-based events like cross-country and you were a good runner, etc., and you excelled at aerobic type sports, there's a good chance you've got good allocations of slow twitch fibers in the right places. If you were stronger, more explosive, you won the sprints and the long jump and the high jump and that kind of stuff, then the likelihood is you had good allocations of fast twitch fibers in the right place. So you can get a muscle biopsy. It's a pretty invasive procedure, but you don't really need to, because at the end of the day you're going to know where you excelled and where you don't. Just going back to that information I gave you before, that most people are about 50-50, that explains why a lot of us are around the same sort of ability, and those few people sort of really stick out when they've got the right genetic material. Also explains why we'll never be able to compete on the same level as some of these Olympic type athletes. So, another confusing picture probably. We've got a pair of slave hands here chained up, and that's going to help us explain why we have the genetics we do, essentially, and why certain countries dominate in athletic sports in multiple disciplines, but the genetics has been spread across multiple countries, and we'll talk about that now. So from an evolutionary standpoint, remember that our distant ancestors' daily survival was often to get water or to hunt food and that kind of stuff. So there were people that were very gifted at that. You would probably send those that would make the journey, you know, the 20, 30 kilometre journey to get water from a well and be able to carry that back. Whereas you'd send out the quicker and more explosive people to try and hunt an animal, you know, to wrestle a bear or to throw a spear at something. You needed some strength, power, and that kind of thing. So people were good at things and naturally moved into those sort of disciplines to keep life going. So depending on the genetic makeup and who they decided to copulate with and what was produced out of that genetic material sort of determines a lot of us today. Where do we come from? What is our heritage and what were our ancestors doing? So one question that's fascinated people for a long time is why are black athletes in particular so dominant in different areas of world athletic events? And in particular, how can they be so dominant at two ends of a very different scale? We know that all black athletes around the world are effectively of African descent, so they've come from the same country. But the African athletes that come out of America and Canada and Great Britain are typically found in sprint and explosive-based sports, whereas the African nations, when it comes to world athletic events and the Olympics and that, are primarily known for their distance events. And how can that be? Well, let's have a look. So there's two sets of African descended athletes, and you can see that the body types of these guys are very, very different. You've got your Kenyan marathon runners at the top there, and you've got your Olympic sprint team from the USA down the bottom there, both descendants of Africans. How did this come about? So slavery is probably one thing that historians and people that have looked into this have sort of pinpointed as a key instigator of what we were just talking about in the last slide. So the British and French empires went in search of some people to work in their mines and in their fields and those kind of things, and they found an abundance of slaves in Africa. Obviously the black populations were thought of as inferior in these days, and the British and French would either take them back to their own countries or would use them in Africa, particularly South Africa, or would stop off at different places with good known mineral deposits and those kind of things, and one of those places was the Caribbean. And during the 1600s and 1700s, that's what happened. We had slavers turn up, basically line a village up, and cherry pick people to work on their plantations, to work in their mines, etc. Now, if you're going to do that, you think about who you're going to choose. Who am I going to choose in a mine to lug rocks around and wield a pickaxe and those kind of things? And the obvious answer is I'm going to take the larger, stronger looking ones who are going to be able to lift more for me. It might also be a bonus if they've got a bit more muscle on them, that they might last the long boat trip back, because I'm not planning on feeding them much. So yeah, let's take these bigger ones and leave the runty little wee ones behind. I also want to not have to come back to Africa as a slaver, so we better take some women as well, so that we can continue to produce good slave children and adults in the next generation. Who am I going to take? Again, I'm going to take the bigger, stronger looking females who will be able to work for me as well, but also survive the boat trip and bear children. So what we have is a situation where a lot of the stronger and bigger African population were taken off to the Caribbean, to places around the British Empire, and to America, and later times to work in the cotton fields and those kind of things, and the sugar plantations. And of course the descendants of those people grew into the people that we see coming from those westernized countries today, such as Great Britain and the USA. And of course, if you breed with pretty select genetic material, you're going to effectively produce super genetic material, and that's essentially what's happened. On the other hand, what have we got left in Africa, where these guys are still having to traipse long distances to get food and to get water and that kind of stuff? You've got the lither, slighter African men and women that were left, and of course their genetic material is going to be shared as they breed, and of course you have a concentration effectively of slow twitch material happening there. And of course out of that comes a long dynasty of marathon running and so on. You don't see many Caribbean black African marathoners, from Barbados and Bahamas and that kind of thing. They're all on the sprint track or throwing a javelin or a shot put or doing something explosive. So, work through that stuff there, and of course their descendants. You can see two very different looking populations there. So we'll go back to the picture here, and that's true of all the Caribbean islands and that. You can see that fast twitch fibers definitely develop more. They're bigger muscles, they're stronger muscles, and of course they develop and you end up with quite a muscular athlete. Whereas on the other side of things, slow twitch to slow twitch, you're going to see much leaner and lighter. And that's not just to do with a lack of food, it's to do with the genetic material that they were given. So there we have it. So we can also transfer over to white men, and we can see that the guy on the right from Finland there, obviously is a slow twitch athlete, a marathoner. Yes, he's got some emaciation happening there due to all the hours of vigorous training and getting into fuel deficit and that kind of thing. But the odds are to be good at a marathon, represent your country, you're going to have a good allocation of slow twitch fibers. And you can see down here, if you want to win an Olympic medal in the 100 metres, you better be born with about 80% fast twitch fibers in those key areas, the glutes, the hammies, the quads, those driving muscles, the calves. And if you want to win the Olympic marathon, put in an order for 80% slow twitch fibers in some of those key areas. So that is essentially some genetic freaks there. And that's why you and me are always going to struggle to keep up with people like this. If we were to do the same training, obviously we'd get left for dead because of the genetic material they have. So you might be able to think back on your lineage a little. Where did we come from? Where did you come from? It's very individual. And even in a more direct sense, think about your appearance. I'm certainly a diluted version of my father. My mother had zero interest in sport, zero interest in activity, probably because she wasn't very good at it, and that was probably a case of having bog standard genetic material that she was working with. My father, on the other hand, was very successful, and I am a diluted version of a mixture of their two genetics. You may also be interested to think about your siblings, and did somebody get more of the sporting gene or the explosive sort of gene than other people in your family? And I certainly got the most in my family. My sisters were never really interested in sport, and again didn't excel in those areas there. And it doesn't take a biopsy to find this information out. By the time you're the age you're at. So, an individual muscle is a mixture of three types of muscle fibers, type 1, 2, A, and 2B, and you have what you have depending on your genetics, effectively. If we look at the picture here, you can see that each type of muscle fiber, represented in the colours here, we've got red, orange, and the lighter colour here, has a different motor neuron firing it, because a slow twitch motor unit needs a slow twitch motor neuron, intermediate needs an intermediate, and a fast twitch needs a fast twitch. And of course, if the threshold is reached in the individual neuron here, so if this is a motor neuron here I'm following, the red one, then only the red fibers would fire 100%. If the orange ones were to reach the threshold, then only they would fire. And if all of them were to fire, then of course the whole muscle would contract with maximum force. So, we've learned how we can manipulate muscle contraction. We're going to look at a few more things that dictate muscle contraction strength, just to finish off the lecture series here. One other point to come out of this is the training you do and how does that affect your muscle fiber types. And the top sentence here is the most important one. The total number of your skeletal muscle fibers has traditionally not been thought to change. Okay, so you've got what you've got. You can enhance them through sustained training, but you can't convert your fibers or multiply your fibers. Sedentary men and women, as I mentioned before, have about this split here, 55% type 1 and about 45% type 2. The people at the higher end of any sport, at the elite end, will show greater distribution than that, as we mentioned before. Okay, so it probably begs the question a little bit, if I haven't got the right genetic material, what's the point? Should I even bother training? And the answer is, of course you should, because you can enhance the fibers you've got. It's the key. No, you might not throw down as much muscle as someone else going to the gym if they're largely fast twitch. No, you might not jump as high as someone else who has better genetic material, but you can certainly improve what you can do. And remember, there's more to success in sport than just genetic material. There are so many other elements that we'll talk about coming through. Now, if you do heaps of endurance training, then your fiber types will adapt. Okay. So the question here is, if you are an elite endurance athlete and you do have a higher percentage of slow twitch fibers in your muscles compared to untrained athletes, is that completely due to genetic endowment, or is it the years of vigorous training? And of course, the answer is both. You can have all the genetic material you like, but if you don't train, then of course you won't reach the highest level. And it is a difficult answer a little bit because unfortunately we only really take biopsies of athletes once they've made it. So we can't get a direct comparison from birth and early childhood right through to the success that they have as an adult, because we don't start taking an interest in them until they start excelling. So until people are willing to take biopsies from babies and that kind of stuff, that's not going to change. Most research at this point says it is impossible to change your fiber types, and that's mainly because of the type of plug or neuron that it has. So it would take more. Yes, your slow twitch fibers will act more like fast twitch fibers if you train predominantly strength and explosive type sports, but you'll still have a slow twitch motor neuron, which means they won't fire as quickly as the fast twitch and therefore won't help out as much as they could if they had a faster neuron attached to them. So that seems to be one of the big limiting factors. So why bother training so hard? Because you will get better. You will get better. Your training will get your existing fibers to be stronger, to be able to last longer if endurance is your key, or to be more powerful with sustained training. If you were to do just endurance-based training, then you can expect increases in these three things. And this is why I got you to write down these three as part of your list of 4 characteristics for slow twitch fibers. All muscle fibers will increase their mitochondria, their myoglobin, and their capillaries to enable you to last longer in endurance-type situations. And that includes fast twitch fibers. They'll never be as good, but they will definitely increase in those things. Let's dip into our questions here and finish off a few of these. You can answer question 18. What has the largest influence on a human's muscle fiber allocation? The answer is genetics. Number 19. Which muscle fiber types are the most adaptable? That's definitely intermediate or fast twitch A. Number 20. What is thought to happen to muscle fiber numbers in response to exercise? The answer is nothing. Nothing happens to the number. And then what chronic changes occur in muscle following long-term endurance training? And the answer is you'll get increases in these 3 things that we just had on screen: increased mitochondria, increased myoglobin, and increased blood flow or capillaries. Those are the 3 answers you're looking for there. So what about weight training? That's endurance. Resistance training increases the size of all muscle fibers, because for strength you need all muscle fibers working, but it seems to particularly increase the diameter of type 2B fibers or fast twitch. So again, if you have a greater allocation of fast twitch 2 fibers, then you will grow bigger faster. If you are predominantly slow twitch orientated, you'll be very good at the endurance aspects of weightlifting, but you'll probably find the growth is not coming as quickly, so you might be a hard gainer. All right, so type 2B fibers, that is a question that we tap into here. Number 22, resistance training is thought to mainly target which fiber types? The answer is type 2B or fast twitch B fibers. So fiber type is determined by your genes and actually varies little comparatively with training. Fast twitch A fibers are the most trainable and adaptable, we know that. They don't just switch whenever you want them. You have to do a sustained period of training for them to get to act more like slow twitch fibers or fast twitch. And if we're talking about it from a sports context, if you're involved in a running-based sport where the majority of the sport is running, like a rugby or a basketball or netball, then you'll probably find them acting more like slow twitch muscle fibers because, of course, the majority of the training you do is aerobic-based. As you get older, your muscles lose their ability to fire those fast twitch units. And that's really just a use it or lose it phenomenon where if you don't sprint or do anything explosive for a number of years, the motor neuron pathway effectively dries up, meaning you don't lose the units, but you lose the ability to fire them. And that pretty much means that you're more of a slow twitch orientated person when you get older, which might explain a wee bit why a lot of middle-aged people get into distance running and that kind of thing, because they'd really suck at the explosive stuff. They haven't done it for a long period of time. They'll use it or lose it, and therefore the one thing they probably can do is more endurance-based stuff. So you see a lot of middle-aged people getting into their cycling and fun triathlons and fun runs and those kind of things, and that's probably the reason why. A champion's born or made? Well, both. Yes, you do need to start with some good genetic material if you want to reach the highest level, but you also need to consider some other things, and these are some. Number one, you need to know how to train to get better. You need to apply good nutrition principles. You need to be mentally tough. There are so many athletes that have good genetic material that are just not mentally tough and won't do the training required to reach that next level. And you need to be motivated. And that can be a problem for people that have good genetic material. You see a lot of people that are really good at a young age because they have the right material and they develop quickly. But unfortunately, as part of that, sport's really easy for them in the early days, so they don't have to train hard. They don't develop that training work ethic, and unfortunately, they drop away from the sport when it does become hard. And you've got to be fit. At the end of the day, you've got to be willing to do the hard work. All right, last thing, and we are done with this. We need to pull out a couple of factors that affect muscular force generation. The question we are looking at in our mock questions is question number 24. What are 5 factors that can affect the amount of force a muscle can generate? Let's have a look at them now. The 5 factors are injury is number 1. You can write that in. Particularly soft tissue injury like ligament damage or connective tissue damage around tendons, muscles, that kind of thing, or joint injuries. That's going to lead to your brain not being willing to exert maximal force in the muscle around that joint because of pain, and that's an off-putting factor, obviously. So injury to anything around the joint or to the muscle itself will inhibit your ability to produce maximal force. The second and the most important one is the number and type of motor units that you produce. A larger muscle is obviously going to produce more force. It has the potential to produce more force. It doesn't mean it's going to be functionally better. It's not going to make you necessarily throw harder or dunk easier, but size of muscle is indicative of force production. And if you train it functionally, you should be able to improve those things. The main factor in contributing to muscle force production is the number of motor units recruited. The more fibers that are recruited, the more strength the muscle is going to produce. Okay. Just wanted to show you this little phenomenon here called tetanus. And you're probably familiar with the term tetanus from tetanus injection. And what happens to you if you do have a rusty nail and incur tetanus, then your muscle will contract with maximal force and not let go. Okay. We've been through the process of summation before. We know that multiple impulses are required to fire a neuron, and we also know that multiple impulses are required to contract a muscle fiber. In this case here, if we do it in the correct recruitment pattern, i.e. slow twitch to intermediate to fast twitch, and if we do it over the ideal sweet spot for time, what occurs here is these individual impulses build on one another, and you can achieve this smooth, sustained, maximal contraction that we know as tetanus. And really you're only going to come across this in a 1 RM type situation, like one of those massive lifts where you're working for seconds to get that bar up, and you achieve that tetanus and you're able to move that bar, and you've got the timing, you've got the pace and all of those things exactly right. So tetanus is a smooth, sustained, maximal contraction. We'll dip into our notes just for a minute. So already we've been able to put a couple of things in here. Injury size of muscle, and the number of motor units recruited. So 3 out of 5 go in there. We can also track down to here what is tetanus. Tetanus is a smooth, sustained, maximal contraction. A smooth, sustained, maximal contraction. At this point, I'm actually going to get you to cross out number 27. We've already covered summation in the nervous system, the adding together of impulses. We've learned about temporal and spatial summation, so the question for that has actually been cut, and I'll get you to cut that out now, number 27. Okay, last couple. The fourth factor that can affect muscle contraction, strength or force, is the starting length of the muscle when you begin the contraction. And this is all really going back to the actin and myosin relationship. Okay, if we were to start in an overly extended position, the muscle is effectively stretched somewhat at the initiation of the movement. And what that means, if I just flick it into picture here just to show you that alignment before we look at the definition, here's what optimal length would be for a resting muscle at the start of a contraction. You can see all the myosin heads here are connected with actin, and there's also space for a contraction to occur. And we know that these myosin are going to pull that actin towards the middle, so until these guys come to meet, that's the space that we have to contract. And space is important because it's going to allow the building of momentum. So if you imagine each of these little guys here doing 3 to 5 little power strokes a second, you know that once you get momentum in the lift, it gets easier and easier. Okay, so the hard bit's right at the start, you go through that sticking point, and then you build momentum, and it gets easier as the weight is moving. And that is due to momentum built through repeated power strokes from these little guys here. Now, if you start in an overly stretched position, you can see what's happened here. The actin has been pulled away from the myosin, so now only a few cross bridges are able to bind, and these cross bridges here towards the middle have nothing to bind onto. So use the analogy there of a rowing boat. You would have a situation with 8 rowers, but only 4 of them have their oars in the water, and that's going to reduce overall force produced, obviously. And conversely, if we're in an overcontracted state when we start, you can see that there's good overlap between actin and myosin, but there's no room to create any momentum in the lift. So it's going to be very difficult to build anything through that lift to make the lift easier. So we recognize that every muscle has an optimal resting length, which is ideal actin and myosin overlap. And if we overstretch a muscle or overcontract the muscle prior to starting the contraction that we're trying to perform, then force will be lost. So I'll go back a slide here, and you can see each muscle has an optimal length. This allows for maximal cross-bridge interaction. If a muscle is either overstretched or overshortened prior to the initiation of contraction, force will be reduced. And one thing that would be worth remembering is the angle of the elbow joint during a bicep curl. The strongest position by far to start a bicep curl in is about that 90-degree angle. However, that doesn't mean you should just train in that phase. If you want to get stronger through the difficult phase, the full range phase, then of course you should train the full range. Okay, but your strongest position is definitely from that 90-degree angle. Okay, so going in to finish off these questions here, guys, we can add the length of the muscle to one of the 5 factors here, and we can now explain the force-length relationship by saying if a muscle is overstretched or overshortened when the contraction starts, force is lost. When the muscle is either overstretched or overshortened when the contraction starts, force is lost. So our final factor that affects muscle force production is the velocity or speed of the contraction. And we've touched on this already to some degree, but basically we know that lighter loads can be moved faster. That's a no-brainer. We also know that each muscle has its own optimal speed of contraction, and that will of course be based on the type of muscle fibers that it has. If we look at examples here of 3 different muscle groups within the body, we see that the soleus, which is primarily a slow twitch orientated muscle, takes longer for the electrical stimulus to reach its threshold and then dissipate. Whereas the gastroc achieves its threshold much faster, being predominantly fast twitch fibers, and the eye muscles, which are even more fast twitch orientated, achieve its contraction stimulus much quicker than the others. So what that tells us is if you try to contract a muscle that's not designed for that level of quickness of contraction, if you try to contract it really quickly, then of course you're going to be bypassing a lot of the fibers found within it. For example, if you try to really quickly initiate action of the soleus, then the majority of slow twitch fibers won't have time to fire before the movement has kicked in, and therefore the velocity is going to impact on the force that muscle is able to produce. So, key stuff that we take out of this. If the velocity of the contraction is too fast for the muscle, force is reduced. There's not enough time for all fibers to form cross bridges, i.e. the slow twitch fibers won't get involved in the movement at the speed that you want the movement to contract. Now, if you're a 50-50, like a lot of people are, 50 slow, 50 fast, then that's 50% of the available fibers in the muscle not firing in time to help the contraction, which is definitely going to impact on the force that the muscle produces. Now, a muscle's optimal velocity obviously will allow for the types of fibers it has. If it's predominantly slow twitch in nature, then of course the speed at which you contract the muscle should be slower to allow for those guys to get involved. And if it was predominantly fast twitch, you could get away with contracting it at a faster rate to hit that sweet spot of velocity. Now, some sporting movements don't allow time for maximal force production, and that's when you have to produce force quickly, and that's known as power training. And therefore, when we train functionally, power training in the gyms, etc., then we're training to target the fast twitch only fibers. And that's really important, that we recognize what the skill sets of the sport require, and we train accordingly. One last thing to take from this. While each muscle does have its own optimal velocity for power production, on average, just to give you an idea of the speed of contraction that is the sweet spot, about 300 degrees per second is required to produce peak power in most muscles. If you go faster than that 300 degrees per second, unless you have a purely fast twitch orientated muscle, then you're probably looking at a reduced power output. Alright, so we should be able to finish off this last couple of questions, and that is us done. The last of the 5 factors that affect the amount of force a muscle produces is the speed of contraction. And we'll explain it here. We start by saying each muscle has an optimal velocity for contraction. Each muscle has an optimal velocity for contraction. If a muscle is contracted too fast, force is reduced. If a muscle is contracted too fast, force is reduced. And if we want to add a reason to that, it's because not enough time for slow twitch fibers to fire. There's not enough time for slow twitch fibers to fire, so you're bypassing a good number of your fibers. We'll go down to 29. The major factor contributing to muscle force production, the major one out of these 5, what's the most important? It is the number of motor units recruited. That is by far and away the most important factor. And our last 2 questions, if a muscle exerts movement of a joint at around 300 degrees per second, peak power is thought to be maximized. We go beyond that and it tends to plateau or drop away. And finally, does each muscle group have its own optimal velocity for contraction? The answer is yes, it does. But it's likely to be somewhere slightly above or below this 300 degrees per second mark. Alright team, thanks so much for your attention with this. I realise they've been quite long lectures, these ones, but this is the key testable material. What we do from here on in is we take this document here, which has our nervous system and our muscle physiology questions on it. There is nothing in the test that isn't on this sheet of paper here, so if you've missed anything, make sure you go back and fill in the answers there, and then we can study up this information in preparation for class. And of course, what I'll be doing is sending out some practice quizzes. You guys can find them on the Moodle there under Nervous System and Muscle Phys, where you can test your knowledge either open book style for a start, and then eventually closed book style in good preparation for the exam. Thanks for listening in. Catch you in the next one.